There you go. You're here.
Hello. Yes, I'm here and I'm
Hey,
ready as I'll ever be.
you are here, ready as you'll ever be, and I'm looking forward to this. So, everybody who is here now, this is Heidi Kirby. Heidi, you're another one of those folks that we've been connected for a while on LinkedIn, but I don't know that I've actually had the
I don't think
opportunity
we've
to
ever
actually chat.
talked. Yeah.
I don't think we have. I used to have a goal to meet every one of my LinkedIn connections, but I have like 33,000 now. So I don't know that that's ever going to happen, but I still am trying. I'm still working on it.
Good.
So,
Good. That's a lot of people.
what we're going to do, Heidi, you're talking about scenario-based microlearning. So I'm giving you a couple. Well, by the time I'm done with this, you're going to have about an extra minute on this. So I'm going to let you get to it.
Okay.
And then everybody, if you can give a round of emojis, keep the questions coming along the way. Heidi, I will come back on about 2-3 minutes before your time's up. So I'm holding you accountable. And then that is it. All right. Well, I will be backstage. If you need anything, you know where to find me.
Awesome.
Ladies and gentlemen, the wonderful Heidi Kirby. Here you go.
Thank you. So this is going to be a whirlwind. If you have a pen and paper that you want to grab, if you have a double monitor situation and you want to open a blank Miro board or a Google Keep doc, keep everything, or even a blank 7 taps course. You're going to do a little bit of brainstorming here that will hopefully serve you well. After you can go ahead and take what you've learned in this course and apply it later on. So first of all, I saw a lot of questions in the first exam or in the first presentation. And I just want to give you, it's pretty much verbatim. I just posted a 7 taps link into the chat. That is the link to basically this presentation, but in 7 taps form, so that you can have it after the fact and take it with you and keep it forever if you want. So we're just going to get right in. And before we talk specifically about scenario-based microlearning, we want to just talk about scenario-based learning overall in general. And so we're going to use the textbook definition here from Ruth Colvin Clark, who wrote literally the book on scenario-based learning. And she describes it as an instructional environment in which participants solve carefully constructed, authentic job tasks or problems. And so basically what it does is it presents a problem using a story or a scenario, and it gives a lot of different choices so that the learner can go ahead and go through and problem. What is the point? What are the benefits? It helps to build confidence, right? You may not have the exact situation. You may not face the exact situation that you encounter in a scenario-based learning environment, but you can build confidence when you face similar situations. You'll have a better understanding and idea of what to do. It also encourages engagement by letting learners use their critical thinking skills, pick those different choices, move their way through a branching scenario if that's what you have. And then it also helps to bring up retention and increase retention because of the storytelling aspect, right? So the storytelling, we know that helps for increasing retention, but when you're introducing it through stories and scenarios, it's going to help. And it's really versatile. You can have it fully text-based, right? When I give people an example of like real world scenario-based learning, I always refer to the Choose Your Own Adventure books, right? Do you remember those from when you were a kid? Those are text-based, scenario-based learning, right? But you can also incorporate it into games. You can also use video. I've seen some really great ones where they've got full-on actors where you're like pretending you're engaging with them at work and things like that. You can also use AR and VR if you have like all the production money and budget in the world. You can just go as big as you want, but it can also be as simple as you want. So it also helps your learners to be able to really self-reflect and look at their own knowledge deficits in a safe environment. It's safe to fail. It's safe to pick the wrong answers. And so that can help you kind of examine your own knowledge. So we talked a little bit before about how there's like so many tools in L&D and how do we pick the right one. I talk a lot about scenario-based learning, but that's only because I spent a couple years during my PhD program researching it and looking at it. It's not a silver bullet. It can't be added to everything. It's really about just adding another tool to your toolkit, right? So you want to make sure that the problem you're solving is what we call ill-structured. And I'll tell you what that means in a second. But you also want to make sure that the outcome of what you're trying to do with learning, performance, whatever, can be accomplished with the scenario that you have in mind. So you want to make sure that it fits. And then you want to make sure that it covers an ill-structured problem. So a well-structured problem is something that has a really clear solution. It is like one right answer, 2 + 2 = 4. It's recall, it's memory. But an ill-structured problem is something that requires a lot more critical thinking. It doesn't have a clear solution. It might have multiple right answers. It might have multiple good, better, best answers, right? And it's complex. A lot of times we think of like soft skills, right? But when we talk a little bit more about the different examples, I'll share with you, even technical training can have ill-structured problems and address ill-structured problems. So for instance, I made a course on hazard analysis once, and it's very technical. I was working with safety engineers, but it is something that is ill-structured because depending on which safety engineer you talk to, certain risks are bigger than others. Mitigating certain risks is easier than others, depending on who you talk to. So there are things within technical training too that can be ill-structured, and you can use scenario-based learning. So I want you to take like 10 seconds maybe, since we only have 15 minutes, to think of some of the ill-structured problems that you might be facing in your job, with your clients if you're a freelancer, in your organization if you're working in L&D, in the different learning projects that you're working on. Just go ahead and start jotting those down. I'm just going to keep going, keep writing while I keep talking because we're on a roll here. So then we're going to talk about how to build your scenario-based microlearning. And we're going to start with how do we kind of build the scenario piece, right? Before we're actually ready to go ahead and try to build it in a system or in 7 taps, which is what we're going to talk about today. We want to talk about how we just in general set up the scenario. So first of all, there's a lot of different ways that we can approach this, right? We can have something that is just a standalone scenario-based learning just by itself. We can also have what we call a branching scenario. It doesn't have to be branching. A lot of people think when we think scenario-based learning, they default to branching. It can be standalone, but also branching is where you have like 3 different options, and depending on which one you choose, it takes you to a different piece of the story and you work through the whole situation or scenario based on the answers that you choose. You can use it as assessment only, right? It can be the quiz at the end of your e-learning, right? It can be just scenario-based. It can also not be worth any points, right? You can use it as a knowledge check or as something that's exploratory to just, encourage somebody to go through it 1 or 2 or 3 times and choose different answers every time just to kind of explore the situation. And you don't always have to start with like the content or the lesson. Like you don't have to say the process for dealing with a difficult conversation for employees is this. Now practice it. You can immerse somebody, right? Like a good movie that starts right in the middle of the action. You can immerse somebody in that scenario right away and then go ahead and follow up and tell them, this is why this was the best choice. This is why this was the worst choice. So there's multiple options, and depending on what your goal is, you can choose any of these really. But here's kind of the checklist, right? You want to define that ill-structured problem, right? What is the problem? What is the complex issue that you're trying to solve? And then what is the goal or the outcome related to that problem? What is going to be the end goal of that learning? And then you have to create the story, which is the shortest step, but is really in actuality like one of the hardest parts, right? Because it requires good storytelling skills or good writing skills or good scripting skills, right? And then writing a rigorous assessment. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second as well. So if you remember back to elementary or primary school, do you remember all the good things that you learned about storytelling? Remember like the story arc, like, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, all of that good stuff? um, you need a good setting. You have to immerse your audience. You have to bring in characters, let us know their goals and desires, and have a good plot. But we have a lot of great quotes from literature. I'm a former English professor, and so brevity is the soul of wit. Somebody said that earlier. We have to make sure that the stories we're creating aren't too much, that we're not including too many details, that we're giving people enough to get the context of the scenario without going too far or being too sparse, right? So there really is an art to it, but it can be done really, really well and really, really short. Sometimes the best thing is to keep it short, keep it simple, right? So as far as the rigorous assessment, this is one of the biggest, I would say, like missteps that I see when people create scenario-based learning. They have too many options. You don't need a ton of options. I've seen branching scenarios that go out of control. It's like a crime show with the board, with the yarn and all the thumbtacks, right? You don't need that many options. What I try to do if I'm building specifically a branching scenario is to only have like 3 options, a really good one and kind of like a middle one, to make it more like real life, right? Like someone can do an average, okay job, like throughout their whole life and get by. So I like to represent that in my scenarios too. Like, yeah, you could still pass if you choose all these answers, but this isn't the best way to do things, and here's why, right? And then of course there's like the wrong answer or the thing that you shouldn't do, right? But with the wrong answer or the thing you shouldn't do, it needs to be plausible. I shouldn't be able to go through your scenario. Anyone here shouldn't be able to go through your scenario with zero knowledge of the subject matter and be able to get all the questions right, right? Like, the example I always use is one that I saw where it was about a caregiver at an assisted living home who was like figuring out how to encourage a patient with dementia to participate in more social activities so that it would help their symptoms a little bit more. And one of the answers was like, ignore the patient, right? And that word ignore made it so very obvious that that was the wrong choice, right? So what I suggested was to say, why don't you say, tell them, like, mind your own business, don't meddle in that person's social life, right? Because then it's like it gives you pause. It goes, is that minding my own business? Is this part of my job? Is this part of my responsibility? And then it allows you to think a little bit more critically. So, like for a difficult conversation, you don't want to go in and say, you're about to have a difficult conversation with Bob. Do you greet him and say, hi, Bob, and shake his hand? Or do you flip the table and say, what the heck, Bob, right? Like, you have to have a little more subtlety than that with your answer options. And what I always like to do also is offer a path to redemption, right? So if you pick the wrong choice, and you've got a whole branching scenario, right? If you pick the wrong choice, is there somewhere where you get the option to course correct and get back on that top right path? Because that happens in real life, right? You can make a mistake and recover and still have a good outcome. And I think that we need to incorporate that more into our scenarios. And of course, this is all easier said than done, but just keep going with me here. Now I want you to write while I'm talking again and think of some ways that you could add scenario-based microlearning to your projects. Is there a future project that you're working on where you could incorporate it? Are there assessments for the projects that you already have, or it could be as simple as just adding something to it? Or are you redesigning something and thinking of different ways to reimagine content? And now we're going to talk about doing it in 7 taps with the 2 minutes that we have left. So, and it is that easy. So basically, what you have to do first in 7 taps is build everything out, map it all out, because you have to have something to link out to on your cards in order for it to work properly. So you map everything out first. However you want to sort, however you want to organize is up to you. And then what you do is where you have your answer options, where you're ready to link out to something, you just go ahead and you highlight and hover over that text, and it's going to give you some formatting options, but you're going to select linking and branching. And that's going to let you link out really nicely to a web page, another 7TAPS course if you want. But what we're talking about today is this link to card spot, which lets you link to another card within that same 7TAPS course, which is how you're going to set up your branching, right? And how you're going to set up the paths. And then you just click save, and it's that easy. And in the 7TAPS course that I sent you at the beginning of the presentation, there's some little examples in there that you can click on and kind of play with and go back and forth. But before we wrap up, oh my gosh, I have a minute left. Here we go. If you have never used 7TAPS before, I have something special for you. If you're a first-time 7TAPS user, sign up for an account on the 7TAPS website. If you drop Heidi in the support chat, you get a 3-month free trial of 7TAPS Pro. And if you want my personalized feedback on a scenario, you can go ahead and take what you've learned here today. You have a whole month until April 2nd. There's a form. I'm going to go ahead and post the link to the 7TAPS and the link to the form where you can submit your scenario in the chat. The link to the form is also in the 7TAPS course, just so you know, so you can find it easily. But if you want some feedback, if you want to try building something in 7TAPS and give it over to me for some thoughts and feedback, I'd be happy to share that with you.
Heidi, I love this. And by the way, kudos to you on the timing of it. I mean, you were so concerned about whether you were going to get to it. And I'm watching the clock going, you're nailing it. Like, you are absolutely nailing it. So
close.
everybody give a round of emojis for Heidi on this one, because I love, not only did you cover the scenario based component, which I have some Q&A for you as a follow-up to that, but also just, I also like the distractions in the back, just so you know. And so did the folks in the group. I'm a dad of 7 under 12. And
yes.
So for me, it's just like my everyday life. And I totally get it. I was in a meeting before this event, and my son just came in and he just like sits on my lap. It's like, well,
yeah, we had to have a conversation about him not yelling at the video games, because he's playing PlayStation right now. He's playing Spider-Man. And so he tends to like get really into it. And so we had to have a conversation like, please don't yell while mom is presenting.
Okay. Well, you know what? It's okay. By the way, as a point of clarity, through my super secret channels, the offer for 3 months free is for first-time 7TAPS users only. So I want to make sure we make the clarification on that, so that when the questions come and people go, I'm already using it, does that mean I get to extend my thing? It is for first-time users only. But so with this, some questions for you. On the scenario base, I love that you bring this up, because I think it's a really important thing. And the art of storytelling is a skill. It really is a skill, because we've all had that person that's the person that you're like, you are really bad at telling stories. They either don't give you enough detail, or they just go on and on. And you're like, good grit. Like, how much detail do I need about the person who sits next to you and they aren't even in the story? So first of all, how do you recommend people get better at that? Because that's not always something that comes through clear when we think about requests, where it's like, we need training on this. And you're given a thing that's like, here's a bunch of information, but I don't necessarily know what the story is for that. So how have you gotten better at that?
Yeah. So as a former English professor, I'm actually going to do a bit of a shameless self-plug here and share a blog that I wrote. Here, let me grab it real quick. But there's a lot of different ways. So I'm going to throw a link to the chat in the chat here. Reading good writers. Like, that's an underrated way to get better. Reading good writers, and then just like practicing. And there's so many different ways within that article to practice, like joining writing communities, or simply just journaling every day. Like, part of it is just writing, and part of it is just practicing sharing stories. So there's things like Toastmasters or things like that you can join, where you're speaking publicly and it's going to help you. But also consuming different types of media, right? Because
Okay.
writing that story, that script for a video is different
It's
than
very
writing it for an
different.
e-learning. Yeah.
It's
So
very different.
watching movies,
Okay.
seeing how reading movie scripts, right? Seeing how they do things is,
Okay.
a lot of it is just reading and trying to emulate, right? Like anything.
I love that. I mean, for me personally, like I share a lot of different mediums of content on LinkedIn for that very reason, to practice,
Yeah.
what's a way I can tell this story? How do I do this? It's also why on my YouTube channel now, I do a lot more with YouTube, because even like shorts, like how do you communicate something in 60
Yes.
seconds or less? Or how do you do this in long form? And again, the practice of doing that, I'll put my thing in the chat. But a big part of this, because I get a lot of questions around leadership stuff, like, well, how do you navigate this? How do you sell this? How do you lead a team through these kinds of things? And by creating video content on YouTube, I've gotten so much better at going, okay, how do I distill this down to my
Yeah.
60-second point? Or how do I do this in 15 minutes or less, type of a thing? And that practicing of how do you tell the narrative in a way that is really impactful and tells a meaningful story.
Yeah, I think
The
a lot
other
of
thing, oh, go
times.
for it.
Oh, I think a lot of times we forget, and like I always encounter this in job interviews with instructional designers. It's like the way I can tell like a newbie from a not or from like an expert is when I ask like, how do you engage your learners? The people who have been there for a while do exactly what Elizabeth said in the chat, which is keep it simple and succinct, right? Like
Yes.
keep it like the shorter it is, the more to the point, the more that they understand what it's for and how it applies to their work is the best. The novices always talk about like gamifying it or adding like all the seductive details in the world, right? But really it's about like, especially at work, like getting to the point, getting what you need, having it,
Yeah.
serve its purpose and then going.
Well, and I think one of the things that's really valuable in that is that sometimes we assume the best way to approach it is to give everybody everything, instead of saying,
Yeah.
give them the minimum of what we think they need. If they have questions or if they need more, they'll actually seek it out or they'll ask follow-up questions. So do we need to be prepared for all of the detail? Yes. But is that what we should be leading with? No, because most people don't actually need all that. And I love the way you articulated that. The other thing I was going to ask, I had memories back to one of the first, back in my early storyline days. I remember I tasked myself with building like a video game, and I remember we did a scenario, and it took me back to that whole, like, it looked like the serial killer map thing where you're going like, okay, and then if they do this, I'm going to assign 3 points, but then and I think your point is really good, to not necessarily feel you have to go that complicated out of the gate. So is there anything you'd add for folks who maybe haven't done scenario-based stuff? Like, what is a good starting point where there's enough of a scenario to make it feel a little personalized and choose your own adventure without having to feel like you truly are architecting an MMO where you're like, oh my gosh, and you just give up?
Yeah. So I think one of the things I mentioned, providing a chance for redemption in the choices. And so,
Okay.
like, getting people back on track, that's actually a way that you can reduce kind of like the serial killer board, right? Is like if
Yeah.
you have an option where you can get back on the right track, I reuse the same answer choice once I start getting into the scenario. The other
Okay.
thing is like always assume it's going to take longer than you think it is, because it
Yeah.
always does, to like plan it all out and move all the pieces parts, right? Like just always
Yeah.
plan for extra time, right? Because
Yeah.
and it doesn't have to be branching. You can have a bunch of standalone scenarios that serve as an assessment if you're pressed for time.
I love that. I love that. Cause yeah, you start getting into the branching. And again, being a former math teacher, you don't always take in the exponential, like, okay, every 2
Yeah.
branches turns into 4 and then 4 turns to 16. And pretty soon you're like,
Right.
holy moly, what did I just do to myself? So I think
Yeah.
your point of it doesn't always have to be branching. And then again, you can keep people along that path. I also like the point you brought up about, um, we do this a lot, right? Making the questions so obvious, but the subtle difference that you made, like completely ignore the individual and punch them in the nose, or be like this. And you're like, really, is anyone
Right.
is anyone getting this wrong type of a thing, or the one question that's like a paragraph long and the other ones that are just so deliberately
Yes.
incomplete. So I think that finding that right level, do you have any recommendations on how do you find that right one? Because you can oversimplify it, but I have also seen people overcomplicate it where you actually can frustrate the end user, where it's like, good grief, like, I don't know, these options are so close, I can't even tell what we're doing.
I think that's when you can really let your subject matter experts and do a pilot and let people just tear it apart, right? I think
Okay.
that's one of the best ways. Like you can take it as far as you think, or even like as far as the subject matter expert.
I
I'm just
love the
glad he did.
holy shoot.
I'm just glad it was shoot. That's all I know. We're live and this is recorded. It's great.
Yeah.
I'm lucky. But yeah, I think like getting that feedback, and of course you don't have to take it all, right? But getting
Right.
that feedback on some of those answers and how you can make them more. The other pro tip too is get the right stakeholders in the room, because they can disagree on what the best course of action is. And you have to get that agreement before you can build out a successful scenario.
Okay. I love that. And somebody in the comments, everybody's still laughing about the holy shoot, which is awesome. That's like, I mean, in addition to the amazing content, the background distractions have been fantastic too. But I think the point somebody brought up in the comments, I don't know where it went, but the point that asking really good questions is, again, it's a skill. And to something like you said, you can tell novices versus people who have thought deeply about what questions and how can even the slightest nuance in the wording actually change the dynamic of the questions to really force somebody to think critically about what they're doing versus just, kind of buzzing by it and smashing through, I got button smashing on my mind because of your son in the background.
Yeah.